coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
Trump is one among few aberrations over the last century of the bipartisan foreign policy approach, which has been more ideological than not. It has had faith in a kind of blank slateism amongst peoples. If you just give them liberal democracy, all will be well and they'll never go to war again. It was the mission creep of the Bush doctrine in Iraq and even Afghanistan, that somehow we'd put liberal democracies in both places and it would solve our problems. I think Trump thinks that was stupid. It's part of his no dumb wars policy going back to his primary run. So he's really a return to a prudential rather than ideological foreign policy. So that's the proper way to view it. All the breathless rhetoric about him betraying his base, I think, is unfounded. And you got to just let the man cook.
Hello, and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books and Autopen editor of the American Mind. I do all my editing in absentia remotely. I just sort of tell an AI the vague outlines of what I want it to do, and then it does it without my approval or attention. Thanks very much to my co-host for holding down the fort while I was gone, allowing me to recover from my altitude sickness last week. This week, I am joined by what feels like the dream team. There was a time when this crew felt like a slightly new gang after we had shuffled around the hosting responsibilities. Now this is the OG crew, managing editor Mike Sabo and publisher and president Ryan Williams. The gang's all here. We've got a few items to get through, starting with, as I alluded to at the opening, the Biden Autopen saga. I think this is roughly 3,025 news cycles ago. We heard about the Autopen, which is one of those things that emerged, and then suddenly everyone on Twitter was an expert about it. But basically, the beginning of this is that when Biden became clearly incapacitated, and when Trump was elected, and as it became clear that there was going to be this grand regime change, one of the things into which Trump and the Republicans asked for a referendum was the extent to which Biden's pardons, his sort of giant raft of last-minute pardons, to what extent were those and other legislations, perhaps that he signed off on, to what extent were those basically validated in absentia or by Biden's staff while he was out to lunch. And the Autopen is the device that would have affixed his signature to documents and legislation, possibly even without his knowledge, but certainly without his actual physical signature using his hand and his pen. Now there is a new development in the story because there is an investigation going on the part of Republicans, and the White House is looking into this and has demanded a bunch of different investigations, which we will get into. But the kind of overall debate here is one of those things that can get very confused very quickly because there's a lot of bad faith arguments made about, well, the Autopen was actually first used by Thomas Jefferson, and it's been part of the presidencies ever since, it's as old as an apple pie. It's American as apple pie and as old as the hills. This is something, again, like the minute this became an issue, suddenly all the legacy media circled ranks to claim that there's absolutely nothing to see here. There's some really hilarious arguments. The Jefferson one, what Jefferson acquired being a man of the Enlightenment and very interested in kind of new scientific developments, was something called a polygraph, which is basically a primitive Xerox machine that would manipulate two pens at once. You could write your signature and then or even a whole document, and the polygraph would write another. He called it the finest invention of the present age. There's also the amusing fact that the actual investigator and the House Oversight Committee Chair, Representative James Comer, has been sending out letters and subpoena notices using a digital signature, which is another kind of thing adjacent to, but not quite identical to the Autopen that we're talking about here. When you get a DocuSign and you click sign here and it just affixes your name to all the different parts of the document, that is pretty standard and par for the course. But it's really not what we're talking about. It's not what's under discussion. The Autopen as a legislative device seems to have first been used, at least in the open, by Obama. That he used an automatic signature. But even that is really not what Trump and co. are all that concerned about. The question here is whether these devices and technologies, especially the Autopen, were used by a cabal, a sort of unelected group of staffers who were effectively running the presidency as Joe Biden started to deteriorate and fall to pieces. And this has come back into the public's attention because of a New York Times piece that came out on July 13th, in which, in typical Times style, the kind of interesting information is buried graph upon graph deep into the text. But what's happening here is that the attention seems to have focused in on the clemency decisions and the pardons, which at the very end of Biden's term, as I mentioned earlier, he pardoned Hunter Biden for like any and all crimes ever on December 1st, and a bunch of others also following right up until like the last day of his presidency. And so the question that's most specifically being raised is, to what extent can he really have known and approved of each individual who was kind of encompassed under this enormous ream of pardons? I'll just read here from the piece. Again, many paragraphs down. The full picture of what Mr. Biden did on pardon and clemency decisions and how much he directed those decisions and the actions of his staff, including the use of the Autopen, may come down to tens of thousands of Biden White House emails that the National Archives has turned over as part of the investigation by the Trump White House and the Justice Department. So the Times has not read all of these emails. I don't think anybody has except the interested parties. But these are going to be, it seems like, the documents that help get to the bottom of this. The emails show that when the White House was preparing to announce clemency grants, communications, staff drafted statements explaining the decisions. Mr. Biden had to be shown the draft. So he's like wheeled up. His like face was sort of pressed against the glass. I'm editorializing here, of course. But Mr. Biden had to be shown the draft, and they could not be released until an aide said he had approved them. On at least one occasion, wording was tweaked because of what an email said was feedback from Mr. Biden. Mr. Biden did not individually approve each name for the categorical pardons that applied to large numbers of people, he and aides confirmed. So that sentence is the one that's getting highlighted on X and shared as this like smoking gun, big revelation. Your mileage may vary. It does seem like there's every possibility that there's something fishy here, given the extent of Biden's deterioration. The actual issue that we seem to be discussing here ends up being quite small. I mean, I rather doubt that Biden would not have approved of the things that of the pardons that we're talking about. But what do you guys think? Is there, or is the cover up more of the story than the story here?
Early on in this, I thought that this was kind of yet another thing that Republicans were going to latch on. Other issues, immigration, etc., were way, way, way more important. And that kind of seems to happen on regular occasion. But especially with this New York Times report and other reporting and the press is kind of, forming a phalanx around the Bidens. I mean, there does seem to be something here. I mean, just even the legal issues, I'd love to have like a lawyer look at this and say, okay, were these pardons? I mean, can the president actually, legally do this and really look at this? Because I think that there are tons of questions here. The line that you signed or that you said from the New York Times piece about Biden not individually approving each name, I mean, that seems to be kind of a smoking gun to me, if there is any smoking gun. Rand Paul, I guess he is reissuing his criminal referral of Fauci to the DOJ. That's based on this scandal. There's the DOJ and the House Oversight Committee are investigating whether Biden's mental health was covered up through the use of the Autopen. So there's so many, there's a central core issue, but then there's also these emanating lines from this that really touch a lot of different things. So it's not just, this Autopen that stems from a larger issue, which was, what was Biden's mental state throughout the presidency? Was it better in 2020? Did it decline? If his staff too covered this up, which obviously nobody wanted to admit that this was actually happening, that this looks bad, even just apart from, really diving into the legal issues. what else was going on? What else are they covering up? What else are they hiding? In that New York Times piece, I think there was some mention of, oh, well, we need to make sure, Hunter Biden's pardon is good. I think Biden actually did directly sign that one. I think same thing with Mark Milley. And, because they said, well, Trump's very vindictive. So that's kind of an interesting statement, just, that alone.
Biden gives an interview to the Times in this piece where
Mhm.
he makes that argument. And so it seems clear that like the high profile ones, yeah, he probably signed off on Milley and Hunter himself. And he at least knows enough about that time to be clear on that, or at least he is now.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, you see that. So there's some like knowledge that I don't know. Maybe what we're doing isn't exactly up to snuff, and there's some admission even with that things aren't typical. Biden's presidency was supposed to be all about norms and the Constitution, etc. And it's just kind of amazing. I mean, this is just the next thing that falls into place where it's like, oh yeah, it's absolutely wasn't about any of those things. There's this thin kind of patina of those things, but really what were the norms being protected? It wasn't the norms of constitutionalism, self-government. It was the norms of really the elite leadership class of the past 30, 40, 50 years. I mean, that is the small c constitution that was actually being protected throughout all of this.
An important point that quite apart from the Autopen, the question whether you want to or can, or whether it's legitimate to sort of pardon in advance Mark Milley, for example, from the things that you have decided in your fever dream that Donald Trump is going to do, it's like a totally separate but equally valid issue.
It's hard to make sense of any of this because the New York Times, as you mentioned, Spencer, is kicking up all the dust it can under the ruse of covering it like a good journalistic organization. I guess the real question is, and I don't think we'll ever get to the bottom of this from their accounting, or I should put it this way, exactly as they editorialize it. It's all on the up and up. Verbal instructions were recorded from Biden. Sometimes after the fact, and then signed off on after the fact by chief of staff. And there's some email traffic that they recount that suggests as much because they've seen maybe 12 of the emails that the House is trying to get their hands on or has gotten their hands on. It's just a rolling problem for Biden and his credibility, and thus by implication for the credibility of the mainstream media and the Democratic Party and the way they've talked about all of the sort of goings on inside the Biden presidency, at least from early summer of 24 until he left office on January 20th, 2025. As Mike mentioned, Rand Paul wanting the DOJ to indict Fauci, and that's Rand said this is the only way you're going to get it into court if DOJ actually prosecutes someone, and then they defend themselves by saying, well, I have this pardon, and then the challenge from DOJ is the pardon was improperly issued. That's how it would make its way into court. I imagine that the Supreme Court wouldn't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. Now, they may be forced to touch it by some lower court ruling in a way that they thought was worse than the controversy of taking it up at all. So we'll see. I just wanted to read a little bit of the follow-on New York Times piece, which was recounting. This is called Excerpts from the Times' interview with Biden on clemency decisions. You can see, given how we know Biden talks publicly, let alone privately, months and months ago, let alone now, I hate to drag my wife Amelia into this, but since I'm stealing her quote, I must.
Yeah, we need the Amelia sound effect.
She's like,
yes, yeah.
She's like, some of those M dashes are doing a lot of work. So here, so this is their question. The format here is the question and then answer. So on who made clemency decisions? I made every single one of those and M dash, including the categories when we set this up to begin with. And so dash. But I understand why Trump would think that because obviously, I guess he doesn't focus much. Anyway, so dash. Yes, I made every decision. On why an Autopen was used to sign the warrants, because there were a lot of them. On the use of the Autopen. The Autopen is, it's legal. As you know, other presidents used it, including Trump. But the point is that, we're talking about a whole lot of people, meaning this is why he needed to use it, because there were thousands and thousands of pardons. But as the Times has pointed out, there really were only 25 actual signatures. So this is a weird response from Biden. It's a typical Biden-esque lie or half lie. Or at this point, is he even lying? Does he even remember? Hard to say. But it's it's this muddying of the waters between why he needed to use the Autopen, which I think the real reason was because you couldn't keep track of what he remembered and what he wanted to do from day in and day out, and you couldn't get much of his time. There's also been sort of reporting, and also I just hear from folks who knew this was going on for a while that he'd routinely fall asleep in meetings, and we've been through all this stuff. But so their process was set up to insulate the president, to actually set up some sort of process, but also to compensate for the fact that he couldn't really be counted on day in and day out, even in terms of how much time he could give to performing his duties. So this is all just one more reading. It's wonderfully rich because Biden again pitches the reason for the late clemencies and pardons and preemptive pardons was because of Trump's vindictiveness of dragging people into legal expenses, which the Biden administration did against Trump and his fellow Republicans who were involved in 2020, and the rest, including our colleague John Eastman. So it's rich for him to say, this terrible abuse of power is why he had to pardon everyone. The best was on granting preemptive pardons to family. In terms of my fam dash, he dash, go after me through my family. I know how vindictive he is. I mean, everybody knows how vindictive he is. So we knew that they do what they're doing now. Laughs. And my family didn't do anything wrong. My sister, my brother-in-law, my brother, etc. And dash. And all it would do is if he went after them is run up legal bills. I just know how he operates. And so I made dash, but I consciously made all those decisions, among others.
Okay, so first and foremost, since this is an editor's podcast, I just feel we need to take a moment and pour one out for the noble M dash, which is being dragged through the mud right now. Between this, the way it's being made to stand in for, you can hear Biden. If you remember his voice, you can hear him like fumbling and mumbling his way through that speech, and the fact that ChatGPT and Grok and other AI large language models notoriously overuse the M dash. So it's become one of the markers that people use to see if something's been written by AI. And you put that all together, this poor punctuation mark is getting just the worst rap. And it's a great punctuation mark. It ranks up there with, I mean, if you have a situation where you need a pause in a sentence, it's not an appropriate time for a comma, or the most appropriate other punctuation would be a semicolon, but that feels too formal. There's something incredibly satisfying about the M dash, and this is just a territory that we're going to really have to defend against the forces of evil, both the machine and both the political machine and the machine. On the subject of the Autopen, I see Mike nodding along, so that's good that we're in editorial agreement on this topic.
Oh, absolutely. There is nothing better than a well-placed M dash. Like,
just ask Emily Dickinson, right? I mean, the great poets of our language. In any case, on the subject of the Autopen, I'm pretty much in agreement with you guys that like the crisis here is the one that we already know about and have talked about extensively on this podcast, which is that Joe Biden was not fit to be president, was unfit far, far longer, probably than we knew, and certainly far earlier than we were allowed to talk about it. Remember what outrage you would be received with if you even so much as mentioned this. And now there's been reporting in the Wall Street Journal. There have been books by James Comey and others just basically admitting we all knew about this. We colluded to cover it up. They were doing their absolute best to make it a non-issue, an unacceptable topic. And then it came spilling out into the public eye at the debate to a man and woman, like at one, as if receiving a transmission. Every major legacy outlet suddenly acted as if they had been on this all along. They were really delivering the hard-hitting journalism about, is Biden too old to run for a second term? That is as scandalous as it is possible for it to be. That is already at the highest possible pitch of the betrayal of public trust. We don't need anything else other than that to feel terribly and righteously aggrieved at the way the people were treated during this presidency. They treated us like idiots. They tried to shut us up, and then they pretended that they were the good guys for admitting after the fact when it became impossible to ignore. Like all such outrages, it's bigger than any one charge that you can possibly bring against it. And so Trump and the Trump movement are, I think, fairly rightly like looking for a variety of ways to kind of put legal meat onto these bones. The Autopen is one kind of subset or representative of how that did probably play out, as are these kind of vague generalized pardons that nobody could ever possibly pinned down to, things that Biden and his state could have approved. And then there's kind of these larger issues about like, well, in what contexts should the auto pen be allowed? And in what context should we insist that the president sort of signs with his own hand? Also, how do we feel about the pardon power, right? Is like, again, kind of a separate issue, but do we feel comfortable with this idea that the pardon power extends to a kind of imperial sweep of the hand, whereby whole groups of classes of people are absolved of all future crimes? Like these seem like questions that the Supreme Court could take up. Congress also could get involved with them. Whether or not it's going to come down to, yes, the specific way in which Biden's team used the auto pen to cover up for him, like, sure, great. If that's how we kind of execute on our outrage at this injustice, fine. But it's difficult because you always come back around to like, well, this particular thing isn't itself the problem. The problem was this like enormous and genuinely galling behavior on the part of an entire class of people that consider themselves our moral betters. And that's just an ongoing theme of
Yeah, we should have John Yu on to just give us a history of the auto pen and what he thinks.
Mm-hmm.
What he thinks of the implications for this. I don't think any of this is justiciable, really. I mean, the remedy is the 25th Amendment, the cabinet deciding, et cetera, et cetera. That's all passed. Is any court, even a pretty right-wing court, going to want to wade into this after the fact? It would probably, I think I would conclude as a not just procedural judge, but actually as an exercise in judicial statesmanship, that I think you just got to let this dog lie. And to open it up would be to probably do more harm than good going forward with a possible Republican president and the continuing and persistent, although somewhat eroded, dominance of the Democratic Party in the permanent state, the bureaucracy, and the legal world around the executive branch. I think this would be a can of worms you'd want to leave closed. But I'm open to being persuaded otherwise. People want they want some resolution and people to be held accountable. I think at the very least, I'd be with Rand Paul. We should try to make a couple prosecutions of the most egregious offenders, Fauci lying to Congress being one. And then you go through it and courts say, there's not much we can do. And we've all just got to move on. But for now, it makes for a hilarious reading, and just it's one more entry on the ledger of the non-credibility of the current Democratic establishment and how they handled the end of the Biden presidency.
Yeah.
That black mark should remain on their record.
Absolutely. And anything that reminds us that happened is, I think, salutary, especially now as we're all caught up in adjudicating, well, is Trump overstepping this place here and that? And it's perfectly acceptable to, discuss the merits and demerits of the current president and presidency. But you always have to remember, because otherwise they do their best to make you forget, that this is all happening in the context of a tremendous betrayal of the American people's trust by the legacy media. That's probably all the time we can or should spend on the auto pen, except to say that personally, I would like a polygraph. I want like one of those old things to keep in my office, and they do have the one that Jefferson used at Monticello. Let's turn our attention now to the war in Ukraine. We have two ukes to bring to you, Ukraine and the UK. And we'll start with Ukraine. Obviously, you may recall there's a war going on there. Russia invaded, so on and so forth. This was one of the major, I would say this was one of the like second tier of concerns that was put forward in Trump's run for president, was that under the weakness of Biden, there had erupted all manner of wars across the world. And Trump, in his Trumpian way, made a bunch of sort of extravagant statements, including, I'll end this in 24 hours and this, that, and the other. Although his main argument was always, and I think this is probably the most colorable of his argument, his main argument was always, if I had been president, Putin would never have invaded, Hamas would not have attacked, these things would never have happened. But of course, his opponents are focusing on the other stuff that he said, to the effect that, like, when I get into office, I will immediately fix this. And there, the results have been markedly more mixed, including with Putin, where, he's been attempting to broker all sorts of peace deals, and he's gradually lost his patience with Putin. He's saying things that I find marginally hilarious. Like, this Putin guy, like, he says these nice things, but then he's crazy. He's sending these rockets. So it seems that Trump has sort of run out of patience with Putin and with the idea of kind of negotiating a ceasefire in a way that both parties can agree to. Now he's investing quite a bit in arming Ukraine, although he's doing it in a different way, significantly from the way that Biden used to. There's a nice piece by Phil Wegman at Real Clear Politics about the differences. It's pretty even-handed and neutrally reported, but Wegman points out that, among other things, what Trump's actually doing is selling weapons to NATO to supply Ukraine, which means that NATO is the one paying rather than the US making a kind of gift, dropping a donation of weaponry at Ukraine's door. Also, if Russia does not yield in 50 days, Trump promises another 100% tariff on all Russian goods. So there's a lot here, I think, for us to discuss, and some that is new. We've touched before on the internal disagreements on the MAGA right about foreign policy. There's obviously a older version of American conservatism or of the Republican Party pre-Trump that was somewhat more bullish about intervention. The so-called neocons and neoconservatism are very into like foreign wars and democracy promotion and so forth. There's been an enormous reaction against that, and many people want Trump to sort of represent the vanguard of that anti-neocon reaction. But there have been indicators that, in fact, he's not the opposite of that ideology either. He's cautious, I would say, about interventions, and definitely proud of not having started any new wars in his first term, but also has people around him and has himself an interest in seeing that the world order remains one that is safe for America and perhaps even led by America. And this is, I think, maybe part of that, or another data point in that discussion. The Trump official charged with overseeing U.S. intelligence budgets, Amaryllis Fox Kennedy, told Real Clear Politics earlier this year, I'm going back to Wegman here, that the Biden arms shipments were akin to dropping a pallet of money in downtown Kiev without getting a receipt. Kelly told RCP that Putin would never have invaded if Trump had been in office, and blamed the incompetence and weakness of Biden for allowing the brutal war to start in the first place. Unlike Biden, she added, President Trump is focused on stopping the killing, and thanks to his leadership, Russia and Ukraine are having direct talks for the first time in years. So I'm very interested to know what you guys think of this development. Is this entirely to be expected? Does it tell us anything more about the Trump 2.0's stance on foreign policy? And just generally, what do you think of it?
I mean, I, for one, I'm not really that surprised by this. I mean, I just kind of go back to Michael Anton. He wrote a great essay in Foreign Policy. I think it was 2019. And it's really about what the Trump doctrine actually is. And one of the big things he talks about is, look, neoconservatism versus, liberal internationalism versus this school of foreign policy and this. And Trump doesn't subscribe to any of those things. I mean, maybe he'll take certain policies from, either camp or whatever, but he just doesn't think ideologically about this. I mean, he thinks, kind of more like really the founders did. I mean, where it's about judgment, it's about prudence. It's not necessarily being against intervention in principle. And clearly you saw in Iran, he's not against intervention in principle. And that shouldn't have been a surprise because he's never been anti-interventionist in principle. I think there's a pretty clear difference, say, between him and, say, Rand Paul, Thomas Massey, maybe some others who are, fairly just anti-war in principle. Trump is a little bit more able to, look at the situation and respond and react, and not necessarily cut off any particular policies at all, and leave things on the table. So, Trump is not, he just doesn't have an ideological foreign policy that's kind of, crafted and given to him, and that, basically sends him all the answers, and he just kind of, inputs it into a calculator, and it just, comes out, the answer is just there. He thinks about it in just a different way. Again, disagree, agree about Iran, about especially what's going on here. But I just think that his approach to foreign policy is just the approach of many statesmen of the past 100 100+ years. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of years, where again, they just didn't think about it in kind of these more modern, foreign policy schools tend to think about it, where it's just so formulaic and almost it's geometric and it's kind of turned into a math equation. Rather than look, they're nations, they're human beings. Yes, war is a permanent part of human nature. It's sewn into human nature. Like Madison said, men are not angels. So this is just the world we live in and the world that we have to react to. And the US, one of the main principles, I would say, of our foreign policy is independence of action. It's obviously for our national interests. And even, that idea, like national interests, what does that actually mean? Well, it's for the common good of the American people. That's what it's actually about. National interest, I think, sometimes that language, I saw our Vice President Andrew Beck note this on Twitter earlier this week, where, that's a little bit kind of bloodless. And who are we really talking about? The good of the American people. That is who we're talking about. So Trump is going back to, I think, that way of thinking about foreign policy. I think it's a way that's, historically American. It's well within our traditions. You saw this early on with just some of the wars that would have been certainly categorized as war that I think people today may have been, not exactly happy about us getting into, but I think arguably it did help us in the long run. But yeah, I think just that overall, again, whether you agree, disagree about Ukraine, I mean, obviously what Trump, him talking about Vladimir Putin, I mean, that was in the throes of the election. Trump obviously is prone to exaggeration, all kind of things. I think when he said that, people did not take him literally. I think they knew what he meant, that unlike Biden, who was just writing blank checks, Trump was serious about actually ending this conflict and not funding just utopian dreams of somehow Zelensky marching into Moscow and Putin, kissing his feet. Like that was never going to happen. And it seemed like for the kind of the whole Western international elites, that's what they wanted. So I think he's smashing that. But he's also showing, look, Putin, I think, is a little bit harder to move on this, I think, than even Trump thought. So I think Trump is just trying any way he can to try to move Putin and to ultimately get peace.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would just add, some of our friends or fellow travelers on the more non-interventionist right, and they're very much part of this coalition. So they're worth paying attention to and not just ignoring or writing off. Thinking of, the American conservative crowd and others. They like to say, I've seen some of them tweet of late, especially with the Ukraine announcements, MAGA base betrayed. This is not the foreign policy we were voting for. And what they mean by that is we're somehow returning to the establishment, loose neoconservatism of the Republican Party of the last 30 years or so. And it's just the incorrect way of looking at it. Trump's goal remains the same, which is to bring Ukraine, Russia to an end with some sort of ceasefire. He tried the Putin footsie game for a while. He tried, I think, maybe in an over-the-top way to try to, at least rhetorically, give as much credence to Putin's willingness to end this as possible. He's been frustrated in that attempt. Putin, as Trump said a few weeks ago, I don't know. I mean, he talks a good game and then he just doesn't deliver. So Trump hasn't explained it explicitly this way, but this is him pivoting to a different tactic to try to drag him to the table. And so it's not that the goal has changed. Now Trump is somehow embracing the defeat of Russia, evil empire that wants to roll over Poland and eventually to France. Trump has always commonsensically thought that was idiotic. Now he's switching tactics in pursuit of the same goal. And I think you can even describe the Israel stuff and Iranian stuff as well. I mean, his goal was always, as just an aside, we had a meeting at our DC offices during the transition. And maybe I've mentioned this on here before, but one of our senior folks has experience with Trump 1 and was working on the transition told a lot of the younger guys, look, on Iran, a lot of you are much more dovish than the president. If you're going to go work for him, you have to understand he has said Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and he's pretty pro-Israel. So if you want to work well in this admin, you just got to swallow that stuff and roll with it. And so Trump, again, was pursuing his same and unchanged policy goals and stated policy goals here. So, and then finally, in the context of how our colleagues have written about for years about the trajectory of American foreign policy over the last century, Trump is one among few aberrations over the last century of the bipartisan foreign policy approach, which has been more ideological than not. It has had faith in a kind of blank slateism amongst peoples. If you just give them liberal democracy, all will be well, and they'll never go to war again. It was the mission creep of the Bush doctrine in Iraq and even Afghanistan, that somehow we'd put liberal democracies in both places and it would solve our problems. I think Trump thinks that was stupid. It's part of his no dumb wars policy, going back to his primary run. So he's really a return to a prudential rather than ideological foreign policy. So that's the proper way to view it. All the breathless rhetoric about him betraying his base, I think, is unfounded, and you got to just let the man cook.
Yeah, the non-ideology of it is quite striking. Not so much in that Trump is not ideological, which is just sort of a feature of his character, and I think sometimes hurts, sometimes helps him. Probably helps him more often than hurts him. But really fascinating is the way in which that approach just does not compute with so many people. And the left's reaction to it is typically to say really silly things about, well, Trump just has the object permanence of a toddler, and it's whatever, who's ever in the room with him right now, whatever happens to be in front of his face. Like they love, I listen to a lot of lefty political podcasts, and when they get on to Trump, it's like they're incapable of sensible or reasonable analysis because they really do proceed from whatever they think is the most insulting thing to say about Trump at this moment. And part of it is like he has no opinions, he has no philosophy, he has no ideas. I think that's clearly wrong. What Ryan and Mike, you're both gesturing toward, that is a very definite idea about what would be good in foreign policy, just not a developed ideological theory about how to get there. Which is why I say that helps him, because that's actually how prudence works, right? You have a goal, which is safety for Americans, America first, and then you have a variety of different possible tactics to get there. So the left is incapable of understanding that. The right, though, is not immune from projecting an ideology where none exists. And I think that's what you were saying, Ryan, about the Iran thing, for example, is like you really want to make Trump into the avatar of your very online theory about how it's fine if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, which is, by the way, wrong. But like you really want to make Trump into the avatar of something that he's not. I mean, fundamentally, he is kind of a boomer. Like he does think that the post World War II arrangement where America rules and America first is good, and he's just kind of trying to go about getting that. I hope that this new approach like helps him. I personally like it better than the Putin footsie approach, but I also see why he felt it was necessary to engage in that for a while and try to broker a deal. He may yet try to do that, and he may yet succeed. We will come back, I'm sure, to investigate what the outcome of all of that is. We want to spend a little bit of time before we go looking across the pond. On our 4th of July episode, I read a quick poem or a section from a quick poem by Tennyson about the noble and some have said special relationship between America and the United Kingdom. And even then, Tennyson was arguing that America would have to reteach to England the lessons of freedom that England had imparted to the world. And I remember that now as we take stock of some of the things that seem to be happening in England. We'll post a link to a piece by Mary Harrington at her Substack. Mary writes sometimes for The American Mind and many other outlets as well. She's got a piece up called Pray for Albion, which is, I would say, more than Mary's usual pieces, which are quite kind of clinical and analytical. That's one of her strengths. This is really a cri de coeur. I mean, there's something deeply despairing about this piece, although I don't think Mary ultimately despairs. But she's living under a Labour government. Labour, that is to say, the left in the UK has a large parliamentary majority. As I understand it, which is to say dimly, this means that they can basically push through bills which have a lot of opposition to them. Keir Starmer, the prime minister, is the head of the party. But their parliamentary system means that even in a narrow coalition, there's a lot of power in this majority, and in fact, this is a pretty big majority that they have now as part of the exile of the Tories. Fairly recently, they pushed through two bills, both of which are quite extreme. One of them decriminalizes self-administered abortions. The other one opens up the door to legalized euthanasia, which is something that's happened in Canada as well. And the results there have been quite dystopian. As Mary says, just Google MAID if you want to know. MAID is the Canadian version of this. So whereas America is kind of undergoing this like Trumpaissance, it's still unclear where the ultimate destiny lies of our current moment. But it does seem like we've really turned a corner. In some ways, the UK looks right now to me like the road not taken. Like it really does. It is kind of moving further and further down this like post-Christian technocratic road. And the other element of this is the free speech element, which I hope we'll get into discussing. It's complicated, at least for me, because many of the great arguments for freedom of the press and freedom of speech are English in origin. I'm thinking especially of Milton's Areopagitica, and certainly the American way of doing public discourse owes a lot to our British ancestry. At the same time, however, it's only in America that you have a First Amendment. There's no First Amendment equivalent in the UK. There's no formalized protection for freedom of speech. And in general, there's never been a principle that like no speech can be criminalized or off limits. Having said that, it certainly seems as if the regime has become in recent years far, far more intolerant and aggressive towards certain kinds of speech. Obviously, those kinds of speech are the dissenting kinds that we might approve of: dissent from COVID, dissent from LGBTQIA plus star stuff. I mean, this really is like at the level of you post on Facebook about maybe not thinking that it's great for children to go through trans surgeries, and like the cops show up at your house. There was a really interesting like kind of counter example recently at the Glastonbury Music Festival, at which a British punk rap duo led a chant of death to the IDF, and was met with some condemnation by Starmer, and in the US had their visa revoked for a subsequent scheduled tour. But you compare that to somebody like this fella Montgomery Toms, who Ryan sent by a really interesting interview he did on a podcast called Heretics, not Young Heretics, that's my podcast, but Heretics, in which he talks about getting arrested for holding a sign that said basically the trans flag equals mental illness. And what's striking about, there's a lot of things that's striking about this interview. One of which is that Tom's is so moderate. I mean, it's not even like, oh, he's so based, you know. He did hold this sign as a way of making a point. But he says in the interview, like, this is completely different from homosexuality. He says that, you know, he thinks he's happy to kind of engage in open discussion and whatever. But he feels, I think quite rightly, that the regime has become incredibly censorious. And the other thing that's interesting about this interview is how young this guy is. He says he was 14 during COVID, and that's what radicalized him. So the last thing I'll say before I hand it over to the guys is, do you think that part of what we're seeing here is the radicalization of the youth? Of course, it's very bleak to kind of learn all this stuff about what's going on in the UK. On the other hand, during COVID, one of the things we kept saying was, well, there are going to be kids now who grow up who only have known this and are going to be like unfathomably based. And when you listen to Tom's talking, he's really gesturing and aiming toward an American style free speech regime, which is actually, I would say, probably more, as it were, conservative from our perspective than what a British conservative might previously have said. So my last question is, like, do you think that we will see a UK rebellion of the kind that Tennyson hoped for? Or do you think that they are going the way of the rest of Europe into just like total technocratic meltdown?
There's been a rebellion brewing, and the arrayed forces of established political authority in Britain, including the police, have tried to squelch it at every turn. And despite the occasional populist eruptions in recent years, from Brexit to Farage getting a seat to all the rest, it doesn't really seem to get enough traction in Britain. And the possible revolting class faces a real demographic problem. They're not at the point of no return yet, but barring a huge upsurge voter participation amongst the dwindling traditional heritage core of Britain demographically, that is sort of, just to speak crassly, sort of older white Britain, in the face of a lot of new immigration from really started in the 70s and picked up pretty aggressively in the 90s and after, but especially in the last 15 years or so. They're in a pretty bad spot, and they're arresting, a dozen or so people a day for stuff they post on social media along the topics you spoke about, Spencer, but increasingly, especially on the topic of the violence issuing or emanating from their recent imports from the third world and from former colonial Britain. So it's pretty dark in the UK. I would say, if I had to be very dark and gallows humor about it, they may finally get a real turn towards conservatism in Britain, but it'll probably be under a burgeoning caliphate or Islamic regime gaining steam in parliament, and as a pretty powerful minority, which it already is. And so I don't know how you reverse that, especially in a putatively, now we've just listed a bunch of ways in which the UK is illiberal, but in a putatively liberal country, I don't know how you change trajectory on that quickly, without breaking from some of your traditions, which I suspect would be quite jarring. But, if things get really dire, anything's possible, I suppose.
And you really look at, I think the two paths is really appropriate here. You look at what the US has done, especially under Trump, and you look at, a guy like Boris Johnson. Oh, he was supposed to be, the United Kingdom's Trump. Well, look at how that turned out. And then you have prime minister after him. Now you're left with Starmer. Yeah, I agree. I think it looks far darker in it there, certainly, than it does here. I think there's a lot to be positive about in America, but I don't see that much, at least right now, over there. You do have something with the youth. I think there is something to it, but to me, it just, I'm not sure how big it is. I'm not sure, if that will do anything right now. You do have certain people speaking out, but I think it's going to have to, unfortunately, get much, much worse. And then even that, who knows? Total regime change. Maybe Welbeck was right in submission, and that was not just fiction. And you did mention too, the First Amendment. There is no First Amendment, and the problem of free speech over there too. Noel Yaxley actually had a great piece in The American Mind. I think it was just a few weeks back, where he talks about this. He talks about the case of Lucy Connolly. So she received a 31-month prison sentence due to a message that she posted on social media. A message. Contrast that to Douglas Mackey, who I think a court just basically acquitted him, I think, of all charges for his message, and that was around, I think, the 2016 campaign. I think it was a meme. So you look at that comparison, and we're certainly going on two different paths. Noel in his piece also talks about British pro-life activists who are arrested for silently protesting outside abortion clinics. Silently protesting. If that kind of thing happened here, even under Biden, I think there would just be a huge, huge outcry. I just really don't think that would be acceptable. Even say if Democrats try to pull something like that, and I know they have, obviously, through the IRS and other means, but something that direct, I just don't think. And that just shows, I think, the two trajectories the countries are on at the moment. There's a lot of ruin in a nation, but you have to start wondering with Great Britain, how close they are to the end of, at least, the traditions and the history in the country that they have been. And it's a scary thing to contemplate, but I don't think you can keep doing what they're doing and, have Britain stay Britain. And I think it should just serve as a cautionary tale here. Look, things are turning around, I think, in this country in a big way, but I think we narrowly avoided what's going on in Britain. And that's not to say that in a generation or two, we couldn't fall back if maybe we get too hubristic about things. Like Reagan said, it's, liberty's always a generation away from dying. So it's definitely a cautionary tale to be sure.
Yeah, I think we talked about the Mackey case when the conviction was handed down, and it's nice to have that positive update. But the other thing that's coming to mind is that the last time we talked about England, I think it was because Elon Musk was talking about the rape gangs, which is a good example of kind of all the dynamics that we've discussed. This scandal that nobody can, or even in some cases is allowed to talk about, that finally became impossible to ignore, of these grooming gangs. And I think it touches also on the issue of, like, if you are going to have an unwritten constitution, then you can't also have a massive unassimilated immigrant population. Like, we've discussed before, that despite the fact that we currently have this terrible immigrant crisis that we're trying to undo, it's not that America isn't generally open to immigration. And in fact, immigration is something that we're able to do better than most other countries, because traditionally, at least, we've had this incredible assimilation model. We've had this like conveyor belt for taking people in from other places and making them into Americans. But both part of those are important, the taking people in and then turning them into Americans. And that second part relies upon a very definite idea about what it means to be an American, which includes our written constitution as well as our norms, our sort of norms of free speech. There's also our protections for free speech. And that is something that I just don't think. I mean, one of the things that's endlessly fascinating to me, and again speaks to that Tennyson poem, is the way that after America burst onto the world scene and kind of redefined what it meant to be a just and valiant nation, all of these European countries, especially after World War II, like started unconsciously rewriting their own propaganda to approximate to America's self image, while at the same time accusing America of failing to live up to its own ideals. So you get all of these hilarious, like, Dutch people saying, oh, America isn't tolerant enough. Here in Denmark, like, or in Amsterdam rather, like, diversity is our strength. And you think, like, no, it's not. It's never been. Like, that's not a European thing. And so weirdly, there's this deep desire to, like, approximate American ways of life without American history or ideals. And it ends you up in this, like, worst of all possible worlds situation. So I do think, like, to Ryan's darker humor point, like, it's going to have to go one way or the other here. Like, the European countries are going to have to just sort of recover the fact that they are actually specific nation states from the real, like, nation state core of history. They have a particular demographic, they have a particular set of cultures and norms and way of life. And maybe, like, they're not going to look exactly like America, but that includes, like, probably having pretty severe immigration laws. It's a long way from where things are to there. And I don't know. I guess we just wish our European friends the best, because it does look dark.
Yeah, I mean, they're much smaller countries, so they have less room for error, and they've been importing as a percentage of their population. Canada comes to mind too. Australia also. One of our Publius fellows this summer was a foreigner, but a friend of Western civilization. And we pressed him on Australia, and he said, the big cities in Australia, where most of the population of that country live, are 40-50% foreign born now. And this has been a pretty quick transformation over recent decades. In America, we're much bigger, and we have a lot more ability to absorb, and especially, how would I call them? Sort of culturally dissident or culturally distant minorities. You think of one thing that's been making the news a lot lately with a new candidate for mayor of Milwaukee, I think, is this growing Somali population in Minnesota. And that really, it was a few of them. And then the import Somalis regime, that's an indelicate way of putting it, but it'll suffice, I think, was expanded under Obama. And now they're a strong enough, vocal, well politically organized, and cronyist in disposition group in Minnesota to have real impacts, especially in the cities. Now, those are a series of isolated problems in the United States, but in a place like the UK, it's just become a much more aggressive problem more quickly. And so I think the trajectory of the Trump administration, one and now two, on deportations, on closing the border, and all the rest, is helping us begin to get a handle on this problem and to appreciate the fact that it's a problem. And so our bad possible future with too aggressive an importation of culturally distant religions and peoples. The future that we could have had and may yet still have if we don't keep an eye on this can be seen across the pond.
And I'll just add quickly, just J.D. Vance's recent speech that he gave upon receiving the Claremont Statesmanship Award. This is why America cannot be just an idea. It's there's matter, there's people, there's place, there's history, there's tradition. Now, of course, there are certain political principles as well, and I think sometimes we can shift so much to the other side where it's a people where all of a sudden those political principles totally get jettisoned that are universal in a sense. They can be universally appealed to, even if not every people is ready for them. But yeah, so just to kind of add that too, and I think this shows, look, if you're importing different populations that don't have these traditions, the country, the regime will change just by default. You're not going to have the same nation. It maybe have it maybe called America, but is it historically America? No. Maybe called, Great Britain, but is it going to be actually that? Is Westminster Abbey just going to be sitting there kind of as an empty tomb in 200 years? That's the question.
A few just anecdotes from American imperial history and also the writings of Claremont folks. This recognition of the difficulty of matching form to matter. That is, so if we take the America as an idea principle, that is the form of the place is the Declaration of Independence, natural rights, natural law. And then the matter of the place is the people that are there. The interesting historical fact of America being heavily 90% plus Protestant, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant at its founding, and all of the evolutions since. Read that history however you like, but those are details you have to take cognizance of. And I'm just reminded of William Howard Taft, a man who I know a lot about for a variety of academic interest reasons in graduate school and from friends. So when he was the first civil governor of the Philippines, he said, obviously we're transitioning out of this military occupation. We're trying to set the Philippines on the course of independence of some sort and extract ourselves from this imperial gift or inheritance we were given from our victory in the Spanish-American War. We'll give them the Bill of Rights, but not all of them. And this would be shocking and horrible to modern, both neoconservative and Wilsonian liberal ears. But Taft's point was very practical. He said, well, we'll give them most of the Bill of Rights, but we can't give them the Second Amendment because he didn't quite put it this way, but because they're so close to military occupation that we might have a problem on our hands of unrest. And we can't have trial by jury because for whatever historical Spanish imperial cultural reasons, Taft had observed that you can't really get Filipinos to swear on a Bible and tell the truth under oath. And so there's this lingering tribal rule of law problem that would mean jury trials right now would do more harm than good and would muck up the progress we're trying to make in, to put it in the language of that time, in sort of tutoring these people up towards liberal governance or liberal democracy. And then finally, I had just assigned this old Jaffa piece for the Publius Fellows in my dissident right section of the Publius Fellowship. And Jaffa, in many ways was the arch America is an idea guy in many ways. But he also, while extolling the virtues of the American idea in the same letter to the editor he wrote, I think in the CRB in the 2006 maybe, he also mocked and downgraded and pointed out the ridiculousness of the Bush doctrine's plan for Iraq, where he said, look, you've got this Sunni Shia problem where every political problem or nearly every important political problem is a problem of theology and who gets to go to heaven. If that's most of what you're deciding in politics, you can't have liberal democracy. Mm-hmm. So, and he points out, it took the West a long time to figure that out with religious wars and all the rest. So barring some change in culture and religious political culture in the Middle East, you got to figure out some other form of government than liberal democracy if you want to have anything like decent government.
Well, with that, we, I think, have already taxed our listeners' attention long enough, but we're going to add a little bit more. For now, you still get this for free. It will soon disappear. It will be yanked from your grasp, and you're going to have to pay extra for it. But more on that in due course. Let's leave on a few cultural recommendations. Either of you guys have anything to add for our folks?
Yeah, I at one point in his later career, Leo Strauss said that the thing that the young lack is experience. And one way to get it without living longer is to read great biographies. And he pointed to Churchill's Marlborough as the greatest political biography of the 20th century. I'm going to tack, by way of analogy, towards one other way to get some experience, or at least the flavor of a place at the time, is to read good historical fiction. So I had a couple recommendations. We were bantering at the beginning of this, and they popped into my head for a variety of reasons. But I just want to point folks who might be interested in getting the vibe of the breakdown of Republican Rome, this long series from Colleen McCullough, the Masters of Rome series. She has other historical fiction, which is all great. But the one that I brought up to our group was The Grass Crown, which is her second book in the series that starts really with the rivalry of Sulla and Marius. The first book in that series is called The First Man in Rome. The second one is The Grass Crown, and then she goes up to Caesar. And anyway, good stuff. And then it just reminded me of this old series that I really loved when I was a teenager, which has held up well, and she keeps cranking them out, a bunch of different series of historical novels and even standalone ones on medieval England in its various times. And the one that first turned me on to Sharon K. Penman was this novel called Here Be Dragons, which was book one of her Welsh Princes trilogy. And it was the story of the kind of proud and warlike Welsh being subdued by the English. But she's got a bunch about the War of the Roses, about the Plantagenets, all kinds of stuff. So if you're into that sort of thing, it's a good way. It's like a high-end beach reading for our summer. You learn some stuff, you get a sense that you're not doing point by point reality based history, but you're also learning from folks who've immersed themselves in those periods of those places. And it's a nice way to get yourself back into that time and to understand the politics and the history of the place in an enjoyable way. So historical fiction.
So for me, with James Gunn's new Superman movie, I've actually been watching the originals, starting with the 1978 one, which actually I have not watched any of the first four at all. I think the first one I've seen was the 2006 Superman Returns, which was kind of, dogged at the time. So it's going to be interesting actually to watch it again. So I just finished up the first one, Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor, Marlon Brando. So fantastic cast. Richard Donner directing. So before his Lethal Weapon days, and Christopher Reeve, who it was interesting to me, at least my impression of Christopher Reeve, that he just wasn't as good of an actor as actually he ended up being actually in the first one. I was actually kind of surprised. So that was actually quite a pleasant surprise. And then so now I'm about halfway in the second one, especially Life with Kids. It's really hard after you put them to bed to actually watch an entire movie before you go to bed. So that doesn't really happen that much anymore.
You mean before you pass out, Mike?
Correct. Yeah. Before, in my recliner and, wake up and it's 1 a.m. So I am making my way through all the Superman movies. And this was actually, I started doing this because at Aaron Wren's Substack, there was a really good review of just Superman in American culture by Joseph Holmes that I think came out last week. So he just went through the changes in the characters, Lois Lane, what she represented, this, kind of very cynical kind of take to all of a sudden now in the more modern ways, she's almost the optimist. And to Superman is not quite as much. So it's interesting just how, all those changes, especially, you look at America and, post Watergate world, that made total sense. So anyway, that is what I'm going to be doing. And I'm sure it's going to take up, at least the next couple weeks. And I hope to also see the new movie, the Superman movie, in theaters too.
Yeah, I'm not excited about it, but I'm definitely going to go see it. I would maybe we should talk about it on the show once we've all made it, because those old ones are classics. They're kind of pre the peak Marvel era that we've now been living through and past. So I have a recommendation for a kids movie. So actually something, Mike, that you can watch while you and your kids are still awake. This comes to me via listener who goes on X by the name of Art Pleb. He's one of my favorite of our listeners that I know of on X. And he suggested that I check out, which I never would have done otherwise, the movie K-Pop Demon Hunters. That it's exactly what it says on the box. So there's probably no way I would ever have watched this unless Art Pleb had cued me into it. But it is worth checking out, especially if you have kids and you're looking for a good summer movie for them, because Pixar, which was kind of the last great kids studio, is really in shambles. Like a good kids movie should be a decent work of art that appeals to people of all ages. Obviously, Disney in its classic era is the prime example of this, but for a long time, Pixar just like didn't miss. And then they moved into what I hilariously, this is called online the Quirk Chungus era, which is just every movie has these sort of weird globular kids with quirky faces, and they're so quirky, and like their quirk is that they're Asian, or their quirk is that, like, the latest one, Elio, which I have not seen, was I think a gay parable that then got all the gay stuff taken out, and so it then became just a kind of formless, bizarre, nonsensical mess. What's great about this, and this is not something that, like, again, I don't know that K-pop is something that necessarily appeals to a lot of our listeners, but what's great here is the specificity. If you picture Kubo and the Two Strings, another great kids movie, meets Charlie's Angels, meets Frozen, but with a little bit less of the weird, like, anti-hero nihilism that lurks in the background of Frozen, I think you'll get the idea of what K-pop Demon Hunters is. I actually haven't finished yet, so I'm not totally sure what the so-called message is going to be, but just the vibrancy of the art style, the clarity of the story, the cultural specificity of not just like, let's do something that's off-white for the sake of it, but like, this is an actual art form that exists. The music's great. The choreography is great. Very cool kind of antidote to the decline of Pixar by a relative unknown. I think I was just noticing that the director, Maggie Kang, doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. Produced by Sony, released by Netflix. You can get it if you have a Netflix subscription. So if you're ditching Pixar and you're bummed out by the quality of kids' movies this summer, check out K-pop Demon Hunters. And with that, that's all the time we have and a little bit more. Thanks to all of you very much for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to know more about our work, you can check out our publications at AmericanMind.org, ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, and the work that is done at our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. There's also our general website, claremont.org, and there is where you can donate at claremont.org/donate to support everything that we do, which we greatly appreciate in amounts large or small. If you want to be shouted out on the podcast, you only have to ask. We were, just as we were recording, we got a lovely donation from somebody who did not ask to be shouted out, so we won't. But if you want to be shouted out, that is also available to you. Thanks to our production and engineering crew, the Brothers G, Jake and Ryan Gannon, and thanks to you all for listening. We will talk to you next week.